Hello there, my name's Card. I'm a social sciences and history researcher with a very long-standing interest in theology and the study of religion to boot. Given that I've taken to making these little videos here on my YouTube page, exploring my thoughts and what I've learnt, I'd really like to spend at least a little time on this topic today, since it's something I myself have been plenty interested in pondering over the years. What does heaven physically look like? Firstly, I usually make these videos practically audio only, but today, since we're dealing with a visual topic, I'll put some imagery on screen as I go this time, just as an aid, although hopefully I'll still be able to convey all of my observations without relying on just pointing to a picture though. I'll also just lay out a little bit of an introduction before we get too stuck in too. If you ever happen to find yourself watching this video, odds are that you're honestly not that devoutly religious of a person. You might happen to broadly identify with a particular denomination or another as a sort of social marker, but realistically, you aren't all that likely to have any heartfelt, faith-based convictions one way or another. I'd be willing to bet you'd probably never even actually sat down to read any sort of scriptural material of your own free will as an adult either. For better or worse, it's just the nature of the current cultural moment. Yet, when you saw the word heaven in this video's title, or when you heard me read it at the top of the script a minute or two ago, you still knew exactly what I meant, and you could have had an idea in mind already about what it's supposed to look like. Whether you're personally religious or not, you can't escape the fact that certain bits of iconography and imagery are just part of the common imagination at this point. Even in this post-colonial, globalized, neo-lib era of history, we've all been left with this bastardized, homogenized, half pseudo-theology, half pop culture conception of what this vaunted paradise we call heaven is supposed to be. And how we ended up at this point is a topic that's been on my mind for quite a while now. So right now, I'd just like to work through a sort of abridged history of what heaven has been held to physically look like through the ages. Then circle back to how we got to where we are now before finishing this off with some observations of my own. So let's get into it. The idea of open quote heaven, by one name or another, is essentially something that's been around as long as Abrahamic religion itself. A lot of the earlier polytheistic pagan belief systems that predate what we would now call early Judaism do incorporate some sort of realm of the gods. The Greeks traditionally believed their deities held counsel above or atop Mount Olympus. Scandinavian folklore has a mythic feasting hall called Valhalla, up a magic tree on top of a rainbow bridge somewhere over the horizon, for example. But this early Judaism comes to codify something significantly different. What we mean by heaven specifically here, that these earlier theological frameworks aren't exactly conceptualizing, is the particular idea of a post-mortal plane of existence created by an almighty deity for the eventual habitation of people, but it's an afterlife that naturally you experience after you die, but is otherwise completely inaccessible. And realistically speaking, that premise alone is basically as far as the earliest Jewish speculation on the matter got. Essentially, what happened was, whereas the prior pagan religions most often took the idea of some sort of idealized world beyond the known confines of mortality to reside somewhere out in the actual natural physical world, ancient Hebrew thinkers concluded that any divine realm that happens to, open quote, exist would have to do so somewhere completely above the tangible world as we know and experience it. and that it's basically impossible to know any more than that in this life. So the proto-Jews conclude that there's little point in baselessly speculating on the matter. And for what it's worth, a lot of contemporary Judaism currently takes a not dissimilar view too. A lot of modern Jewish theology essentially boils down to interpretation of and commentary on the body of pre-existing Jewish religious and historical texts. And while there's debate over whether or not any sort of afterlife might be heavenly or hellish or what have you, the general consensus is just acceptance that this, and for that matter, what the dwelling place of the Almighty might look like too, are just simply unknowable. So, in short, Judaism canonically vacillates somewhere between vaguely reaffirming the implied existence of some sort of afterlife in the presence of one God, and at the very least, never explicitly denying the existence of such a thing. I find this resignation to accepting the impossibility of complete knowledge on the matter very practical, to say the least. But it speaks to the nature of the Jewish faith's broad base and historically horizontal structure and regional isolation that there isn't one universally agreed upon answer here. As much as this sort of theological pragmatism might come off as a bit banal, it is sort of interesting how you can see that this non-emphasis on any sort of afterlife paradise reward in Jewish eschatology has developed within the scholarship following the historical exodus of the Hebrews from Egypt, as a conscious effort to decouple the Jewish religion from the contemporary Egyptian one and its conception of the afterlife. Ancient Egyptian paganism was highly concerned with one's moral character being judged by the divine upon death, and this determined what kind of afterlife you'd be experiencing for all eternity to come. It's a fair comment to say that this was a core pillar of the whole ancient Egyptian belief system. But Hebrew scholars' commentaries from the time of their immediate post-Exodus period come to this general consensus that while the nature of their monodolatrous afterlife may be ultimately unknowable to the living, that it would nevertheless be more ethically correct to abide by a moral code without expecting divine recognition or reward. Still, some, like the medieval Jewish theologian Maimonides, among others, did entertain the idea, without necessarily endorsing it, that should the Jewish community's broad adherence to their moral code ever appear to be slipping so drastically that the community were in crisis, it could be justified that religious authorities within the Jewish community start to consider the teaching of the presence of both a pleasant and unpleasant afterlife, essentially the heaven and hell paradigm, with which to use the idea of to promote adherence to Jewish moral values. The argument goes that just as a parent might use the promise and eventual dispensation of some tangible reward, such as a treat or money, to entice their child to study, because the child is too young to properly grasp the value of studying for its own sake, so too might there be community value in reinscribing the value of communal adherence to established morality with the promise of divine reward if the value of moral steadfastness for its own sake is evidently not being understood by most. Although here Maimonides himself never prescribes what form this hypothetical instructive idea of heaven or hell ought to look like either. So, on the whole, historically, Jews have left the question of what heaven physically looks like more or less untouched. Therefore, as you might very well have expected me to say at some point in this video, the first people to really explore the idea of heaven in terms we'd understand it as today, that at least ever took off to any significant degree, were the initial followers of Jesus Christ and the specific branch of post-Messianic Judaism left in his life's wake we now know as Christianity. The biblical authors contemporary to Christ's life, and the immediate next generation of Christians in particular, wrote much more on the nature of the afterlife and what was to be found there. Early Christian church fathers described heaven as not just the physical domain of a sole omnipotent God, but also as the eternal residence of the faithful and otherwise righteous deceased of all nations. Those faithful either living on in some everlasting spiritual form, or in perfected, resurrected, or remade bodies of some kind. Prior to the First Ecumenical Council of Nicaea, codifying a lot of what would and would not become sanctioned and official church canon in the year 325 AD, Christian texts naturally speculated a lot to the best of their abilities as to what this heaven they affirmed did exist would actually look like. However, comparatively little describing heaven's actual physical properties ultimately made it into what would become the canonical Christian Bible. But it was still much more than had ever been authoritatively described by earlier Jewish texts. The book of Revelation in particular expands on stuff that began in Genesis, describing the kingdom of heaven as a city of worship in which God keeps a court of the righteous. Just as man was made in God's image, evidently so too did man's cities take their form from a divine template, and presumably, that's to say, a city as understood by an inhabitant of the urban Near East 2,000 years ago, not just any type of city. Furthermore, descriptions of heaven's amenities here almost make it sound like the gardens adjoining a royal residence or an ancient palace, just on a much grander scale. It's clear that by the time Christianity split from Judaism, centuries of Jews living alongside, if not frequently under, Egyptian, Babylonian, Persian, Greek, and Roman culture in the Mediterranean had indelibly left a lasting influence on the Jewish cultural imagination of what constituted manifest grandeur. Critics of this analysis, both themselves, Christian or otherwise, have also been making one primary argument against this description of heaven, as long as it's been around, too. Despite its basically rock-solid place in biblical canon, that is, that it's merely anthropomorphizing abstract concepts like a transcendental divine creator and resurrection for all eternity, just for the sake of making it comprehensible to people reading it, rather than necessarily reflecting the true nature of those things. I.e., the one true afterlife just so happens to look like something imminently recognizable to ancient Semitic culture because it was created by ancient Semites. This line of thinking usually posits something like, if cattle were capable of creating religion, their god would just so happen to look like a cow too, and their heaven would be a pasture, because it's just what they know. But that in and of itself is neither here nor there in this particular discussion. Further physical properties of heaven, and for that matter, the torturous, bad afterlife, hell for that matter, are alluded to a bit more throughout the canonical works, although very little is definitive, and quite a lot of it diverges from the rest. The basis for a lot of our current Western conception of heaven is rooted more in the early Christian oral tradition, which was itself a holdover from earlier Jewish practices. By some accounts, the sky itself is described as the literal underside of the dome heaven sits upon. In others, heaven is physically above us, but far out in space, so far out that it cannot be seen by the human eye at all. Some biblical authors refer in passing to heaven being enshrouded by clouds. Others allude to it as being like a tiered garden made from every type of precious stone. There's not necessarily a whole lot of explicit description of what form this city of heaven itself takes, but we do get a few other hints at what other divine architecture looks like towards the end of the Bible. Again, in the Revelation of John, a description of what Jerusalem itself will look like after the resurrection of the righteous and faithful dead in Christ is given. And once again, it sounds like a really gaudy, ancient palatial city. The streets of the city are pure gold and transparent as glass. The city will be ringed by a great wall, radiant as jasper, and inlaid with 12 gates, one for each of the 12 tribes of Israel, and each made from a single pearl. A river, clear as crystal, runs through the middle of this city, and on its banks grow trees bearing 12 different kinds of fruit all year round. Interestingly, this city is also described as both requiring no source of external lighting nor a standing temple of its own, as the physical presence of God himself after the resurrection will both literally illuminate the city, and his munificence serves as the object of worship more directly than could ever be done in any earthly chapel. The contents of this vision do tend to get conflated with heaven itself a lot too. And not just with the modern laity either. There has historically been a lot of debate within the church as to whether the description given in this account would be likely to apply to heaven proper, or whether what is described by St. John here is meant to actually be a unification of the mortal and divine planes, which will be experienced by the faithful as heaven itself. Either way, a lot of this description, particularly the part about pearl gates, has been absorbed in the pop culture zeitgeist, which I'll be looping back to discussing further in this video at more length a bit later. Another element, expanded on significantly by early Christian writings, is the idea that within God's heavenly court are a number of creatures or beings wholly endemic to the afterlife. This is where we get a lot of our modern conception of angels from, which itself is a bit of a conflation between the concept of the righteous dead's resurrected eternal form and discrete celestial beings who serve in heaven. The Jewish mythology that a lot of early and folk Christianity is drawing from, again, isn't awfully specific in describing what these beings look like, especially given the abstract nature of the Jewish understanding of God's domain. But it does throw out several distinct names. Of the beings constituting this angelic heavenly host within God's court, the seraphim and cherubim are the two most frequently cited examples. Each are described at various points, most frequently in apocryphal texts, as multi-winged, multi-faced beings keeping watch over heaven and earth's inhabitants. At one point as flaming lion-like guardian beings bearing swords, at another as fiery flying serpents, and most frequently as spinning and interlocking wheels covered in eyes. It's a visual shorthand that I'll also be returning to take a closer look at later in this video. Canonically, the Catholic Church recognizes and commemorates the existence of angels and their role within current catechism, and goes on to cite the appearance of at least 3 angels on earth in human form by name, that being Michael, Gabriel, and Raphael. The Eastern and Coptic Orthodox churches each recognize a further 4 by name, and acknowledges the presence of thousands more. Further details are fairly scant. There isn't a great deal of relevant source material to work with. But it's also worth noting that there are a few other holdovers from Jewish mythology that are said or assumed to be roaming around somewhere within God's transcendental plane. The behemoth is a massive and immensely powerful beast formed by God at the beginning of creation, but for unknown reasons was denied a place on his earth. Similar is the Leviathan, a giant sea serpent mentioned both in Psalms and the Book of Enoch. The Septuagint, the first holistic Koine Greek translation of the entire Hebrew Bible, also refers to a group or race of creatures called the Nephilim, which are implied to be some sort of humanoid giant, but within the hierarchy of angels, and inexplicably familiar to the people of ancient Canaan. In that first century after the emergence of Christ, basically incorporating anything at all from the pre-existing Hebrew folklore was on the table. So there's a lot of fantastic beings and concepts that get mentioned once or twice and are then dropped awkwardly from the biblical narrative without much elaboration. Once early Christianity gets worked into a church proper, its theology gets significantly more stable than it had been just for a few generations at the outset there. For better or for worse, rogue theologians were no longer just coming up with new stuff to preach as gospel truth willy-nilly, and as such, speculation about what heaven would look like became less independent investigation and more outright heresy. What the Catholic Church settled on at the Council of Nicaea essentially remains basically what it still officially believes today, at least in this respect. Reforms since have been very minor, and despite the whinings of a vocal few following changes like Vatican II in the 1960s, and have mostly just been concerned with codifying specific matters of homily and ritual, not the central mythology itself. This pretty much squares up everything we open quote know of heaven's physical form in canonical mainstream Christian teaching. But I'd really like to keep going through all the physical descriptions of heaven that have historically been proclaimed to any meaningful reception, so that we can get a broad overview of all the alternative views on the matter. So, if we're trying to answer this question, what does heaven look like, I do think it's worth exploring the answers being offered up by the next group to significantly progress the discourse along on the topic. That next group being the third of the major Abrahamic sects, Islam. Islam's basic framing of the afterlife is very functionally similar to Christianity's before it. In short, you've got a heaven archetype called Jannah and a hell archetype called Jahannam, and which one your eternal soul goes to is dependent on how good and faithful of a person you were in life. The only real main difference between nascent Islam and contemporary Christianity, in that respect, is a few relatively minor differences as to what exactly constituted moral behavior and the exact precepts of the faith. As for the Islamic heaven's physical properties, once again, there isn't a whole lot to go off of. The central Islamic holy text, the Quran, is much more concerned with how people do or don't get to heaven, rather than what it looks like. Much like the Jewish theologians more than 1,000 years prior, it seems that a majority of historical Quranic scholars have resigned themselves to simply accepting that some things may be knowable only to God. That being said, with Islam's assumption that its final and most important prophet, Muhammad, can speak authoritatively on the matter, several relatively minor remarks of his on the nature of heaven therefore carry the weight of nigh infallibility in Islamic theology. There's certainly a few relevant comments of note Muhammad is recorded as having said that I turned up in my personal research for this that are worth mentioning. Muhammad broadly describes expecting Jannah to resemble an elaborate and ornate garden, its structures built from bricks of gold, silver, and nacre, and even asserts that this divine paradise was also the location of the Garden of Eden from which Adam and Eve were expelled. What does get mentioned of the Muslim heaven tends to focus more on its essence as a place of rapturous pleasure adjacent to God's personal abode. Islam cribs the Christian idea of heaven's trees bearing every type of fruit all year round, and even goes so far as to say you can pluck every type of flying bird right from the sky and have it become instantly ready to eat right in the palm of your hand. Muhammad even specifies that the pious inhabitants of Jannah will each be served by a staff of young male attendants and beautiful, subservient, and perpetually virginal women. Muhammad definitely delineates the eternal pleasures of paradise as being much more explicitly material in nature, and grounded in the freedom of the raised devout to engage in consumption of all kinds to their heart's content. Personally, I wouldn't consider being waited upon forever paradise. That's just not my sort of thing. Although Islam even offers an answer to that too. At one point in Muhammad's career as a prophet, a modest farmer approaches him and asks what he ought to find so good about this ostentatious description of an afterlife, if what he finds most enjoyable in life isn't conspicuous consumption or being waited upon, it's simply tending to his crops. To which Muhammad answers, if that's what a pious man would wish to do in an eternal paradise, that's what he'll get to do. It's a short, smart parable, and I suppose it does only make sense that an all-knowing, all-powerful God who can read your innermost thoughts and desires effortlessly could give you any kind of heaven you want. Of course, since Muhammad pretty firmly claimed to be the last real prophet, and therefore his word final, after his death there wasn't any real room for subsequent Muslim thinkers to add to the Islamic theological canon extemporaneously, which means we just can't know any more than that. Although, this very brief look at the canonical beliefs of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam still don't account for all of the popular depictions of heaven currently floating around out there that I want to at least quickly walk us through in this video. But we're at the point where perhaps the biggest single contributor to the public conception of heaven isn't actually a canonical work of any denomination. It's actually something that was created explicitly as a work of fictitious entertainment. As you might have guessed, the next thing I'm going to bring up, which I'm referring to, is Dante Alighieri's long-form narrative poem, The Divine Comedy, particularly here its third and final canto, Paradiso, in which the protagonist ascends bodily through heaven. I'm not going to pretend most people have actually read this thing, although I have, but whether or not they realize, most have seen it referenced in one way or another countless times. Although usually if you see any part of Alighieri's works referenced, it's usually the first section, Inferno, in which hell is explored. You can't really argue that the Divine Comedy hasn't left a major impact on the Western cultural psyche, so I think it is worth examining what Dante offered up as a depiction of the afterlife. Since, despite it being an overt fiction, it has gone on to become one of the most venerated and influential works of theological literature of all time. Paradiso prominently builds upon two main ideas in establishing its heavenly setting. One, that the afterlife is physically out in space, and two, that heaven is split into tiered layers, in this case, 10 of them. Each layer is essentially manifested as one of a set of immaterial concentric spheres, which the Earth is at the center of. Each sphere is equated with a different virtue and eternally houses the immortal souls of worthy deceased Christians, each of whom is accorded a place on one of the spheres based on their piety and character in life. Each sphere's domain is also reflected in the celestial body it holds. In short, starting nearest the Earth and working outwards. The first sphere is the Moon, home of people who were generally good in life but could be inconsistent, which is reflected in how the brightness and visibility of the Moon waxes and wanes regularly. Next, the second is Mercury. It's the domain of the ambitious, but overconfident and fame-hungry, represented in how Mercury is by far the brightest planet, but it's also completely overshadowed by the fact that it's closest to the Sun, which is thousands of times bigger and brighter. Third, Venus, domain of those who most passionately felt love and kinship for their fellow man. Dante is making an allusion to classical mythology here. Fourth is the Sun itself, home of the wisest who ever lived, emblematic of how Alighieri believed wisdom to be the trait most capable of lighting the earth, and where the eternal spirits of people like King Solomon and Thomas Aquinas are said to reside. Fifth, Mars, another classical mythology allusion. This one is host to warriors and martyrs who died in the defense of their faiths and their beliefs. 6. Jupiter, resting place of kings, emperors, and other rulers, provided they used their authority in life to rule fairly and justly over their subjects. The 7th sphere is Saturn, which was the furthest out planet known of in Dante's time, and it's home to the most temperate, humble, and reserved of the faithful deceased. This means a lot of quiet monks and nuns, and others who lived out their vows of poverty and chastity. The 8th sphere is all of the stars out beyond the planets themselves, all the ones that look like tiny points of light from our perspective here on Earth. Out there is where the most faithful are resurrected, like Saint Peter and the Virgin Mary. Beyond that, there is a 9th sphere. That's the darkness you can see behind everything in the night sky, which doesn't house souls per se, but that is where the angels that attend to the divine court all live. The outer spheres are higher in the heavenly hierarchy and are evidently reserved for the most righteous souls. However, while the narrative does use this segregation of the heavenly populace to describe each of the 10 virtues distinctly, it also strays from the allegory to explicitly identify that each and every person's soul, irrespective of which sphere of heaven they inhabit, is nevertheless equally, perfectly, and eternally ecstatically happy in the afterlife. Such is God's perfect munificence and mercy. At the climax of the narrative, Dante's self-insert protagonist is elevated beyond the 9th sphere and witnesses the 10th and truly final tier of heaven. It's a formless place in which God himself can observe the corporeal world he has created. It's completely, incomprehensibly, and overwhelmingly beyond his capacity to express, even after having just described the rest of heaven, hell, and purgatory just fine without issue. If you've ever read 2001: A Space Odyssey, or better yet, seen the classic Kubrick adaptation of it, the ending of Dante's Paradiso is what the final scene of that was ripping off. Right down to a lot of the dialogue, as a matter of fact.
My God, it's full of stars.
That just about wraps it up in terms of traditional depictions of heaven, which is the core of what I wanted to address here. We've taken a look at basically every serious attempt to depict that quintessential idea of an afterlife paradise in mainstream religious tradition. But there is at least one other avenue of thought I'm going to take us through for the sake of making this video a little bit more comprehensive. Runtime be damned, we're going to do a quick examination of what's happened to heaven in the public consciousness ever since the Protestant Reformation. Now, the Protestant movement itself doesn't inherently change any of the pre-existing Catholic teachings on the description of heaven, but it does have to be said that it has inarguably ended up laying the groundwork for the sort of bastardized pick-and-mix theology that Western evangelical Christianity, quite frankly, mires in. The average self-described Protestant these days is not at all theologically literate. But that's not necessarily here or there. Undoubtedly, they would, perhaps more so than any of us, have an idea in mind for what they mean when they say heaven. I'm far from the first person to make this observation, but I have to assert that it is, at least in large part, due to popular culture. Say, even though obviously the vast majority of evangelicals aren't producing pop culture directly, and even if fewer and fewer people are identifying with any religion, let alone a denomination of Christianity, it's still the cultural signifier that's getting reproduced and consumed. This pop culture conception of heaven is typically boiled down to a few common points. A city of gilded or neoclassical architecture built upon solid white fluffy clouds, a big fancy literal wrought gold gate by the entrance, probably itself flanked by St. Peter, who serves as God's bouncer, and is replete with angels that look just like white-robed humans with halos and giant dove wings. You'll no doubt be familiar with the general visual I'm talking about here. It's a cultural shorthand that's been done in countless television shows, movies, games, comic strips, music videos, just about every visual medium at some point, really. TV Tropes has a page called Fluffy Cloud Heaven if you really want a fairly exhaustive list of examples. But, of all the popular culture I could cite here for an example, as much as it might be a bit of an easy choice, if I had to just pick one to demonstrate my point here, the one I keep coming back to in my mind is honestly something as simple, though as ubiquitous, as The Simpsons. Off the top of my head, having grown up past the point where it was already globally recognizable, I know they depicted this sanitized, white fluffy cloud and gilt arches aesthetic more than once. And they even parodied the concept itself on the show a little bit in an episode that touched upon the theme of a crisis of faith.
Maud Simpson, welcome to Protestant Heaven.
3-in-1, hurrah!
Poppy, have you seen Dash?
But where's Homer and Bart?
If I were producing this line of investigative argument as a serious piece of scholarly work, I'd want to raise the question of whether The Simpsons' LA baby boomer creators had just picked up this post-Protestant evangelical view of heaven from somewhere else, in particular along the way, or if they could be said to have influenced the rest of pop culture themselves with it in their own wake. Either way, I still think it's primarily this sort of pop culture depiction of heaven that, for one reason or another, is now actually what first comes to mind for a lot of people if you tell them to envision what heaven will or should physically look like. Before I begin to draw to a close with everything I have to say here, there is one other quick little thing that I promised earlier that I would circle back to as well. And it's something I've invoked a little myself with what the title of this video will be and what I expect the thumbnail will look like. The recent mimetic trend towards referencing, quote, biblically accurate depictions of theological concepts, angels in particular, primarily alluding to Christian texts' frequent description of angels as having an inordinate amount of eyes, or multiple sets of wings, or other surreal physical qualities. Of course, it's all being done with a self-aware, ironic remove from sincerity, in that way that a lot of latent online humor just is now. But it has at least put Abrahamic mythology a little bit back into the discursive public eye. And I feel that things would be amiss if I didn't at least acknowledge it while I'm on the subject now, before I get into making my final point here. See, the real undergirding reason that I always wanted to start this YouTube page in the first place wasn't just to regurgitate information to people. I've approached writing and recording these little videos with one guiding principle in mind: that I'm sharing my opinion with you, the hypothetical future listener, in a really accessible way. If I have a relevant opinion on something that I see being discussed online now, the best way to chime in will be to link you to a video of mine you can simply listen to. That way, it's much easier than getting you to read some long thing, or to try and point you towards a dozen different sources to look into, or even to rely on someone else to have already made a video out there that I happen to agree with completely to show you instead. So with that purpose in mind, what I'd like to give you today is my answer to the titular question: what do I think heaven physically looks like? Well, if you'll hear me out, I think it would look exactly like the Crystal Light 1988 National Aerobic Championships opening ceremony. And that might admittedly sound like it's coming completely out of left field, but I've got my reasons for suggesting it. And it's an idea I've been holding on to for quite a while now. Actually, ever since I just so happened to catch the ripped video of the event itself floating around YouTube on a lazy night a few years back. And I've been completely enthralled by it ever since. I can literally think of very little else more emblematic of what a paradise made manifest would look like. To begin with, you have this giant room that's all of a sudden completely filled with maybe 100 people all running out of nowhere onto the central floor to just begin perfectly working together on this amazing synchronized performance. And they're not just some of the most physically fit and bodily attractive people possible, they're all demonstrating this raw talent and practice in one of the most high-intensity ways possible. And it's not just raw strength either. Aerobics captures this balletic grace that there is behind the muscle that the most roided-up strongmen wouldn't be able to convey through might alone. And no matter where on screen you look, with the sheer scale of this event, there are these practically perfected specimens of what the human form can become just everywhere. And you have men and women of every race from all these different walks of life, all working together in perfect harmony here on the same stage at the same time, assembled perfectly right down to their color-coordinated outfits. It's like looking at this perfect utopian world that's imminently imaginable, but completely impossible for us, the viewer, to grasp. The point is, it's still so infinitely far away because it cannot ever be returned to. Such is the linear nature of time. And all of the aerobics competitors, at least their performance personas, as they were on the day this was filmed, are essentially now preserved in this state of grace for the eternity that this video of the event will exist for. Even the low resolution of all the available footage of the event itself gives watching it an almost ethereal quality. You can see what's happening just fine, but you obviously can't take in all of the finer details like you could if this were viewable in modern high resolution. It ends up coming across almost like a work of impressionist performance art. And none of the people in the video would be all that likely to have ever assumed that one day people could be watching them decades later on a quarter-inch thick video phone via a free worldwide public repository of literally billions of hours of footage. The creators of this aerobic ceremony might as well be ancient Judean priests for how removed from modern society they are, but they've nevertheless made something we can read a lot of visual signifiers out of. In this moment, there is nothing but aerobic dancing. There's nothing else, and there are no imperfections of any kind, physical or otherwise. There is a human animus to compete. This is, after all, a contest between prospective champions. But there is no conflict. There is only friendly, sporting competition. There is no hatred and no oppression of any kind. We see fraternity between these muscle-bound, jockish men, but there is no such thing as a chauvinist gym bro here. There are people of every different skin color represented, but the concept of ethnicity is absent. It's as if the National Aerobic Championships inexplicably take place in this completely post-racial world. Everyone is wearing these comparatively revealing outfits, but that alone hardly even registers to the conscious mind. All these beautiful people, and beautiful women especially, are all literally on display, but there is no objectification, there is no sexism. A decade before white-collar third-wave feminism really took off, when they bring out the host of this televised event after the opening ceremony itself, they don't even introduce him as the chairman, but rather the chairperson of the National Fitness Foundation. It's as if, inexplicably, for one night in 1988, this national aerobics pageant presented a perfect picture of the world in which every pressing social issue has long been solved. But here's the thing, you couldn't replicate this again. Not today, and dare I say, not ever again, and not with any amount of time, effort, or capital. What makes this so special, in large part, is how earnestly it's been made. It embodies these elements so precisely because its creators specifically didn't try to manufacture them. It's like how you can't successfully be campy trying to be campy. Just by definition, campiness is having something you do seriously and earnestly fail to convey the tone you intend for it to carry and it falls flat. Trying to imitate that by just hamming up a silly affect doesn't work, and it just ends up coming across as a poor imitation of the real thing. If you tried to reshoot this now, you just couldn't recapture the provenance of the original no matter what you did. It doesn't matter how much real spandex you use for the outfits, or how big you make the girl's hair, or what kind of VHS scanline effect you throw over the top of the footage in post-production. You just can't recapture the earnestness that the essence of the original embodies. The event we're watching is also just as physically removed from us, the viewer, as anything could be. And it only happened in the late 80s, and most of the people in the video itself are probably still alive. And I haven't even checked because that onto itself is not relevant. With all of the raw effort that goes into a performance like this, I think it's one of the most visually impressive things you can put together. Of course, you could do the same basic concept on a bigger stage with more people, but that's completely missing the point here. Through the use of just a little bit of basic media literacy, you can equate something like this being physically impressive to seeing it as the very expression of a utopian world. This 80s aerobics performance is in many ways exactly what I think a world perfected both physically and philosophically would be. It is, in a very real sense, what I'd suggest heaven physically looks like. That's all I've got to say today, and I really hope you've taken something useful from any of this, especially given the length and breadth of everything I've said. If you'd ever like to hear more diatribes like this, feel free to subscribe and so on. Once again, my name's Card. This has been Card Posting. Until next time, goodbye, and have a lovely day.